it really is just trying to look at the funeral industry and trying to add some humane elements to it and trying to kind of just talk a bit about death in a way where we can acknowledge that death is a thing and we have to begin to talk about it in order to be comfortable with it. So that movement is called death positivity.
Hello and welcome to One Cool Thing, a podcast from indie game studio Die Gute Fabrik, hosted by me, Hannah Nicklin. One Cool Thing is a podcast speaking with people in and around video games about one cool thing not from games, which is really fascinating them right now. I'll introduce them and their practice, talk about the one cool thing they've brought to the conversation, and consider how it's shaping how they think about their work. It's a chance to hear more about the practices of cool folks working in games, and hopefully it's somewhere where we can all reflect on how we think about how we make things. So, without further ado, let me introduce our next guest. So welcome to the excellent Kaitlin Tremblay. Kaitlin is a Toronto-based narrative designer and writer working all across the scale of games, from writing on indie works like A Mortician's Tale to working as a team lead narrative designer on Watchdogs Legion. They're also recently releasing, I don't know if it's officially out yet, but it's sort of nearly out if it's not out already, an excellent looking book called Collaborative Worldbuilding for games. Kaitlin started out as an editor and author, so it's super cool to see them bring out a book on games practice and sort of square the circle on those two practices. And really recently, Kaitlin also announced that they're the new narrative director at Soft Rains, which is a recently founded video game studio in Toronto that we should all be paying attention to. So welcome, Kaitlin. How do you feel about the intro? Did I miss anything important out? Anything you want to add or amend?
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, you're very welcome in every sense of the word. I asked you to bring in one cool thing to us today. What have you brought to us?
Okay, so I brought a specific movie that comes within a specific genre, and I kind of want to talk about them both. So I brought the movie, the 2020 movie Host, which is a Zoom-style found footage horror movie by director Rob Savage.
There's something. We've connected with something. We gotta keep going. We gotta talk to it.
This is not good. I told you not to disrespect the spirits. It could be something demonic.
Haley, this is all your fault! Not my fault! This is your fault! Emma, turn the filters off. Come on.
Host is kind of what I think of as like the quintessential COVID movie. It was filmed during COVID. It was released during COVID, or I should say during the start of COVID. And it is a group of friends who are doing a digital seance over Zoom. So the entirety of the movie is just filming a Zoom call, and everything that happens over the Zoom videos. So it is a group of some young women who invite in a spiritual medium to kind of help them facilitate doing a digital seance. And because it's a horror movie, everything goes horribly, terribly wrong in it.
And when did you first come across the film? Like, how did it capture your imagination?
Oh, so it got announced, and I'm pretty active in a lot of horror circles. I do a lot of horror short story writing, and horror has always kind of been one of my favorite genres to both work in and also to consume. And so as soon as it got announced, it was all over all of my circles. Everybody I knew was talking about it. And so a friend and I decided we would do a digital movie watch, and we would go on our laptops together and we would watch the Zoom movie. And it was very weird watching it in lockdown over on a computer, over Discord with a friend while everything was taking place in Zoom. There's a couple moments where it's like I tried to like X out of a screen that popped up or things like that, or like tried to press the leave meeting button, and it was just very surreal watching it in this context, which I think is part of what makes it so good, but I also just think it's excellent on its own.
And can you give us like a little bit more about the plot of Host? So they gather for this sort of digital Zoom seance, and it obviously goes awry, or maybe doesn't, if you consider the point to connect with ghosts.
Yeah, so it's a pretty typical spread of friends. There's the one person who's the believer, and there's the one person who's kind of like the jokester, and people taking it seriously on a variety of levels. And so one person who isn't really taking it very seriously decides to make up a fake ghost that she's having an experience with. And she talks about this, she makes up this really intense experience and makes up the death of somebody who isn't real. And as soon as she does this, weird things start happening, like candles start flickering, and there's obviously a presence that's there. And it gets revealed that what happens is when you're trying to summon ghosts, and if you create what they call like an empty vessel, or you're creating like an empty mask, it basically invites the concept for like any ghost or any spirit to kind of inhabit that mask. And so what happens is this person, by not taking it seriously and by joking around, creates this empty vessel for a malicious spirit to kind of come in and take hold of. And so this is the way they kind of like invite in the evil spirit. So it goes wrong insofar as they invited in the wrong person, and they invited in a malicious spirit, versus it going well where you get to talk to like a pet or something.
Things there, it's fine.
Get around, go back.
What the fuck was that? What is that? I don't see anything there, like them down. Don't freak out, don't freak out. What was it?
I do think what's really interesting about it is the kind of like filmic extension of like epistolary novels, right? Like Dracula is entirely written as letters, and you consume it in this really like point of view of the person writing the letters and receiving the letters. There's also a lot of talks in these kind of circles about how War of the World, like Orson Welles' broadcast, is also a big part of this, right? Because like what these different things are kind of talking about is using diegetic mediums in order to construct the constraints around which you're telling the story, right? So like epistolary novels use the constraint of like it's a diary or it's a letter, and you can only write in the format of which like is believable in a diary or a letter. And so found footage is very much the same, right? Where it is footage that is being filmed by people for some reason. And so therefore like your scenes are entirely constructed around what would they believably be filming? Why are they filming? And I think that's really interesting about found footage is also, it's like, why do they keep holding the camera when things keep going badly, right? And so there's these really interesting kind of like genre affordances that come out of found footage that have roots in things, like Dracula and like War of the Worlds, where you're using a believable sort of medium in order to kind of push this idea of realism to then use that as like the thing you then go and get wacky off of.
In the meantime, we have a late bulletin from San Diego, California. Professor Indelkoffer, speaking at a dinner of the California Astronomical Society, expressed the opinion that the explosions on Mars are undoubtedly nothing more than severe volcanic disturbances on the surface of the planet. We continue now with our piano interlude.
This is like the Zoom found footage, right? Well, I mean, obviously the one that really hit the zeitgeist that most people will have heard of is the 1999 Blair Witch Project, right? Yeah. And that's like a handycam style kind of found footage, whereas this is like a Zoom update for host. And people do talk about the found footage phenomena really sort of kicking off in like the 2000s. I really refuse to say noughties. I'm sorry.
That's
the
fair.
2000s are when this sort of kicks off. And I've always been used. I'm not personally like a huge horror fan. I just like I watched a couple of horrors when I was a kid, and they were kind of scary, and it's not a thing I needed in my personal sort of life and the way I relate to the world. But I'm always really interested in the idea that like the horror zeitgeist kind of reflects, some people suggest, the kind of the psychology of the dominant culture which has produced them, right? And obviously we're largely speaking for like Western or European kind of psyches if we're talking about these productions, because different cultures might have whole other different horrors, right? But people talk about the zombie kind of thing being about like concerns around consumerism, slasher kind of pics being kind of related to the idea of violent crime. And if I sit down and I try and think about what does found footage make me feel about, sort of as I try and identify it as a trend, and I begin to wonder if there's something there about what we leave, what like the records that we make, and especially with regards to host in the digital age, the fragments of ourselves that we put out there and how people piece us together again afterwards.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because like I feel like you're right. The thing that's really draws me to horror is the way it is a kind of a reflection, right? Like horror is often a commentary, it is often a response, right? To political goings on, to social going ons, and horror always has this kind of vein, or what I what I find particularly empowering and interesting about horror is the way it kind of does give voice to experiences that we don't know how to talk about, or maybe we're not ready to confront head on. And so it kind of lets us talk through allegory often. And so I think something like Host is really interesting in the way that it reflects like our tensions of isolation. It reflects the mediums in which we had to connect with each other in this really visceral way. And then it uses that as the source of fear, right? So the 2020s were an extremely isolating, difficult time, navigating something new, something difficult, something hard to kind of reconcile with. And Host comes out with this like, okay, so we're all meeting on Zoom and that's great. And we're learning how to be friends with each other digitally. And we're finding all these new ways of speaking and connecting. And then how can we kind of facilitate terror around this idea of isolation and connection at the same time, right? And so like there's this really interesting moment in Host where one of the women, she gets like pulled off by a ghost and it's very obvious bad things are happening. And her friend who lives very close by is like, I'm going to go help her. And she grabs a mask and she puts a mask on and then she runs. And then you don't see her until she shows up on the other person's camera. And so this moment was really interesting and really powerful to me because it kind of acknowledges that tension between isolation and connection and how those two things are kind of what is the hardest thing for us to reconcile about pandemic and lockdown and all that kind of stuff. And she takes her mask, even though she's going to save her friend, right? And like this was at the time where like we were still like washing our groceries and we didn't quite really have a good handle on how to respond to things emotionally. And so it's just like, I'm going to protect my friend and also save my friend. It was just this really, really cool, small, detailed moment that I really appreciated about it.
Yeah, and I really appreciate media that acknowledges that the past 3 years of our lives has happened. Yeah. Like just as in the public imaginary, there is an urge to pretend that it hasn't because it was really horrible. And I can understand that. So too, in the media, are people not particularly interested in seeing people wear masks? And also, actors like to use their faces. I get it. However, I think I have found really, like I'm a big Grey's Anatomy fan. I'm going to put that out there. And they fully, obviously, as a medical drama, acknowledged the pandemic when it happened, and they did a lot of performing in masks, and they really, really actually dealt with it. And in a sort of media landscape where not a lot was, I was really appreciative of that. I don't think I could have watched it at the time. It pretty much did coincide live with the sort of, the series where they got vaccines is the series where the vaccines started going out. I did watch it on like a 2 or 3 year delay. I wasn't ready to just cry along with all these kind of soapy kind of storylines at the same time. But yeah, I think there's something really interesting about Host responding to this particular moment through the found footage phenomenon as we, really move from like the handheld to the, computer style video. I mean, have you heard of any found footage horror that uses the Internet of Things, that traces a horror through the stuff in your like life that records you?
There is. And so it's a subgenre called desktop found footage horror, or at least that's what I call it, where it's like the movie takes place entirely through like a filmed desktop or like other connected devices. Those ones have existed for a while. And I don't think they really took off, because I think what was really interesting about Host, it wasn't that we're on a computer now and we're filming via filming a computer. It was the kind of confluence of the tech being there and having something to say with that tech, right? So something that I find really interesting about found footage is you get these kind of like zeitgeist moments of found footage popping up when those two things hit together, when you have accessible tech and a director has something to say that's responding to a specific time in society, in history, right? Like one of the earliest found footage movies. It's not a movie I particularly like, but the context around it, I haven't also watched it because I don't want to, but Cannibal Holocaust is often talked about as like one of the first found footage horror movies. And it was by this Italian director. And the impetus for him making it was kind of reacting to the growing footage we had of like war zones and how journalists were kind of able to film a lot of really upsetting things. And he kind of came from this like Italian cinema tradition where, you had some, maybe like you were showing cannibal stuff. It wasn't, it was rife for being censored. And so he kind of had this response to like journalists are able to access and film all these upsetting things and they don't get censored. So like, can I use this kind of growing technology we have around filming wars and proliferating that out to consumers to create this movie, right? But the thing that I find interesting about Blair Witch is it was kind of similar too, right? Like the directors of Blair Witch often talk about like they wanted to kind of, you know, play with folklore. And so what they did was they had three people wanting to come make a documentary about a local witch, and they used accessible mediums, they used handy cams, and kind of whatever was available to them at the time that was the new interesting tech. But then they paired it with this really clever marketing campaign of like, they just put up a website and we're just like, here's the folklore of Blair Witch, and here's like the interviews that they were filming, and they kind of created this like urban legend out of what they were filming. And so they were not just able to kind of capitalize on this existing tech in terms of like cameras, but they were able to capitalize on the state of the internet to be like, you can't really Google these people. Like we're kind of creating a lot of like folklore just by being on the internet. Like a lot of like chainmails and this kind of stuff was coming up at the same time. And so they were able to use these two to kind of create this very zeitgeisty moment of like, oh shit, anybody can do this. And like we can take advantage of the fact that anybody can do this and use this to make a really cool movie. And so Host really feels like it's falling in that exact kind of like accessibility of tech that maybe people have been playing with, but they're pairing that tech with like, oh, and we're going to use it to say something particularly interesting about the time that we are in now. And that's what I find really interesting to me about it is like, it's not just that it's a Zoom movie and it's not just that it's Ghost, both of which I love, but it's that it is very reflective of its time, and it couldn't exist in any other time than in which the time it came out.
I was really interested to find that both Host and Blair Witch have treatments, but no script. So treatment at being kind of like an outline for people of how things will go, but using sort of curated improv, right? So it's not improv in the ways that a lot of Americans might imagine with regards to like improv comedy. The improv is not the product. It's much closer to like a Mike Leigh filmmaking approach. Like Mike Leigh, really famous for setting out a basic plot and, you know, giving actors different levels of knowledge about what's coming next. Vera Drake is a really great Mike Leigh film if you're interested, and sets them up in these sort of improvisational situations, but will direct their improvisation. So, you know, okay, that was great. Let's do it again, but a bit more of this and a bit less of that. And it sounds like both Host and Blair Witch have taken that sort of semi-improvisational approach to how they're made. Is that common with found footage movies?
I'm actually not sure if it is common. Because that's a super interesting angle and I hadn't really thought about, which is the only reason why I don't know if it's common or not. But I can understand it because I think the reason why it fits really well in something like found footage is because there is this kind of desire to play with authenticity in a lot of ways, right? Like a lot of found footage directors refer to it as something as like POV cinema and like try really hard to make it feel really authentic and really believable. And so I think giving that kind of space to not be super scripted can actually leverage more into that kind of believability, because people in real life don't always talk super scripted, and it's really hard to organically write that. And so I can see being able to kind of leverage that improv to further enhance the like, no, these are just real people doing their real people things, and they just happen to be filming it.
And in Host, all of the performers' names are the same as the character names. Like they've gone so far as to make it just feel about as natural as it can to the performers about being in the moment, right?
Yeah, there's this really interesting like lineage too of how much films try to make you think if the actors are actors or not. The popular story around Cannibal Holocaust, which I don't know if it's real or not, but the popular story around it is that there was like lines in the contracts of like the actors couldn't do any public appearances for so long and yada yada yada, to the point where the Italian government thought the director killed these people and he had to like bring them out to court and be like, no, they're real. But again, I don't know how apocryphal that is, but that is the common story around it. Same with Blair Witch. Because the internet wasn't quite what it was, there was kind of this tension of like, are these real people? Are these actors? And it wasn't immediately obvious. But with Host, you have a little bit more of like, no, these are actors. They're playing a part, but we're still kind of using some of the trappings of this legacy of are they real? Are they not? Just because that's part of the genre. And also that's part of like what's fun about these movies is having that small thought of like, are they real people? So I think that's really interesting. It's kind of a really nice nod to me to that kind of legacy of how much do we want the audience to know that these are actors versus not.
So let's sort of like just turn the focus a little bit sort of back to your practice. I mean, let's just start with why horror? Like, why is horror the thing that sort of sparks your interest?
I find horror so interesting, which is like the smallest way to encapsulate one of the most important things to me in my life. But I feel like horror is this really great vehicle for talking about things we don't know how to talk about properly, right? Like, it's the common thing I always say is like, when a woman in horror says, "I'm scared," you are dumb for not believing her, right? Like, her fear is immediately believed. Her fear is immediately validated. Monsters are real. Bad people exist. Bad things happen. And the people who don't believe that are often, people who die are people who are villains. And so there's immediately this kind of like leveraging of believability of bad experiences that I found really empowering when I started making my own horror. But then I also just kind of started seeing that there's places of horror that were celebratory too, right? Like, as a queer person, there's actually a lot of discovery that comes out of horror, of like the parts of yourself that you are told like shouldn't exist, aren't real, don't line up to what is good society type stuff. And like there's a lot of embracing of monstrosity and queerness, and like not in a bad way, but in a like, I get to be my authentic self kind of way. And so horror is both this awesome place for me to say like, hey, here's the bad things and you're going to believe me because it's horror. And also like, here's also the fun, the grotesque, the monstrous that is like both good and bad, and acknowledging the kind of like good and bad can exist in harmony, and that's okay. So I just find there's a lot of politics in horror that I find really empowering and really interesting. And I just think there's a lot of ways in which it kind of honestly reflects back social conditions and politics, and is just a really honest mirror in a way that I think makes it easy for people to get on board with.
Moving on to your practice specifically. So, I mean, I guess A Mortician's Tale is a really easy place to start. I wonder if you could just sort of précis the game for people who might not have been lucky enough to play it yet.
Yeah, so a Mortician's Tale is a game where you play as a new funeral director, and you go through the first little bit of her career where you are preparing bodies for burial. And a lot of the gameplay is kind of, there's three distinct parts. There's the part where you're at her computer and you're just kind of, you're going through your emails, you're checking your newsletters, and you're getting your tasks for the day. And then there's the part where you go through and you do a top-down kind of preparing the body for burial, and you have to fulfill different requests, like, do they want to be embalmed? Do they want to be cremated? How do you handle this? And it kind of, in a stylized way, walks you through very real practices. And then there's the funeral part where you go and you listen to mourners and you kind of just exist at the funeral. So for my practice, I think there's a lot of obvious, to me, connections, right, between stuff like found footage, which is really heavily constraint-based media in terms of like, what is the camera depicting? What are you including in there? How are you accounting for somebody having a camera? How do people behave when there's a camera? There's all this kind of constraint-based affordances that really drives what makes found footage so interesting and so unique. And with, I think, things like Mortician's Tale, where a lot of the writing came through emails and newsletters, it's very the same kind of epistolary approach, right? There's a lot of constraints there about how can I give the information I need to give in a newsletter? How can I do characterization through work exchanges? And how do I build understanding about different funeral practices and the social and political aspects of death through talking to a client or talking to your boss? And so Mortician's Tale is really heavily reliant on these diegetic constraints that I actually think made it quite lovely. It really is just trying to look at the funeral industry and trying to add some humane elements to it, and trying to kind of just talk a bit about death in a way where we can acknowledge that death is a thing and we have to begin to talk about it in order to be comfortable with it. So that movement is called death positivity. So Mortician's Tale is decidedly not horror. It is a death positive game, but that constraint kind of approach is something I took from horror.
And is there anything else you sort of want to develop with regards to host specifically, or how horror in general makes you think about your practice as a game writer and narrative designer?
Yeah, I think there's one scene in Host that is particularly harrowing, but also I think extremely brilliant, where there's one character she's living with her dad at the moment, and she's quite lonely. And so she takes a video of her walking into the back of her room, which is her background, and kind of rifling through her drawers and then leaving. And so that video is her background. So it's on loop the entire time she's in the call. And there's this one harrowing moment where, the ghost is real, people are dying, things are happening, and you just see her background. So you just see her looping. And then this next part is violent. But then you see her head come down and hit the keyboard. And it's this moment of realizing that the background filter is obscuring what's actually happening. So you aren't actually seeing her being killed by the ghost, but these brief moments of like, she's sending like disconnected letters in chat, and like her face breaks through the filter once, and like you just kind of know. And so it's this really clever use of like a zoom feature specifically to give this really harrowing and powerful death scene, where you're not actually seeing a lot of the death. And I just think there's that type of like constraint-based affordance that I think is so interesting, right? Like that is a scene you really couldn't have in many other types of media, and it works so well because it knows its tool and it knows its genre, and it pairs those well and pairs those together so well to be super, super impactful.
Yeah, I super love that. I'm always super interested in form-driven storytelling design, right? And when we talk about that as practitioners, it's kind of almost like an adaptation question, right? Like one of the best exercises for students is to say, okay, take this film and now make it a video game, but think how to not make it the same. Think about how to tell that story, but in a game, and use the different qualities that you might have in games in order to tell that story. And that's a really good example, that sort of the AI of the background only like allowing you glimpses of this offstage violence. My main experience of that is when I try and lift my dog up to show people on Zoom and she doesn't get picked up. So I'm immediately finding that really, quite affecting. Please no one ever attack my dog. I will get you. I will haunt you.
Yeah, we do not condone attacking dogs at all.
So I wonder if you felt able to, for, just as a little tangent for a second, think about, I don't know how interested you are in horror games, but in terms of the different affordances within the field of games, does horror need different tools, different approaches, that exchange of agency that happens compared to film or sort of books? Like, do you feel like the best horror games out there are doing something special?
Yeah, horror games are super fascinating in and of themselves because there's a lot about horror that's successful when you don't have control. And games themselves are so often about control and about player fantasies of control. And so I think famously, right, like games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill kind of started off with these kind of like tankier controls that purposefully made it harder to navigate through the space and made you feel less strong, and it made escaping a little bit more harrowing. And I know Resident Evil was also really big about like camera angle specifically. It's like, what are we showing you? How are we setting up shots? And like, what can we do to kind of create the scenes that you can still kind of walk through and have control through, but that are still terrifying and are still, having these moments of making you kind of enter this like fight or flight kind of moment. Like, how am I responding to this? I think that's been something that horror games have kind of interestingly had to grapple with as technology gets better and as games engines get better and stronger. Players don't often like having camera control taken away from them and trying to not rely on cutscenes so much. And so there's really interesting, I think, levers that horror games are contending with in terms of like what are the new devices we have for scaring people, for taking control away, for trying to limit what you can and can't do. The Blair Witch game, which came out a couple years ago, had this kind of interesting use of cameras and use of flashlights, and like, how can you actually see what's in your environment, and like, how are we showing you what you can fight against, and how are we showing what you can't fight against, and how are we obscuring what you can and can't see? And so there's a lot of really interesting tensions I find in horror games about straddling that line between control and player fantasy and taking that away. that I think like it's kind of an always evolving thing. It has to be kind of responsive to what is the new tech, what are the new standards, like what is the player literacy, and then building off of and top of that, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and certainly I think has in some ways, when people aren't particularly trying to think about how do we do this well, just how do we do it with the tools that we have available, has ended up being quite jump scare full.
Yeah.
When there are, I mean, some games which maybe wouldn't be like fully advertised as horror, but I think of Inside as just a really good example of a kind of creeping vibe that then leans harder and harder into a sense of uncanny. I really can't remember the name of this really, really indie horror series, which is sort of purpley, brightly colored. But I just hear people talking about it all the time, but I think that I'm going to have to try and ask some people and put that into the liner notes afterwards, because it's just not coming to mind. I suppose I'd be quite interested in like what your favorite AAA horror is compared to like a favorite indie one, because again, they're dealing in different, like as you say, the AAA problem sometimes is how how many resources they can put into the thing.
Yeah, I that's interesting. I have to give it a think, but off the top of my head, one that I actually quite enjoyed, and I think there's always layers of like acknowledging like horror, as good of a genre as I think it is, it does contend with certain things. It can be quite ableist sometimes, especially in how it presents mental illness and in trying to talk about difficult things. I think horror sometimes often stumbles. So I just want to have that disclaimer said of like, I think my bar for horror is maybe a little bit more lenient because of my love for the genre. Fully aware that there are often times where these are issues that come up in it. But a game that I found really interesting was recently The Medium, which was by Team Bloober Team. I can't remember which order the words go in there. But it's basically this game where it's a woman who can navigate both the real realm and also the astral realm. And so she goes in search of some answers to her past, and she often is finding that she's split between these two worlds. And so the way the game presents this is it cuts the screen often in half, as if you're doing split screen multiplayer, and you see her in both worlds and you're controlling her through both worlds. And it's this really cool way of using this kind of next gen tech that can have the power to present both fully rendered worlds, to do things like puzzles, to deal with monster encounters where you can only see them in one world and not the other, and there's hazards and there's puzzle designs and things like that you also have to navigate around. And I thought that use of like the split screen in a horror game was really, really interesting, because it's directly playing with the kind of tension of like, what can you see? What can't you see? How can you respond? And that's different in both the views. And it's really clever. And I think it's quite successful at what it's trying to do with that specific kind of like split world reality.
That's super interesting, and puts me in mind of one of our recent guests, Josie Giles, made a piece of interactive fiction which also splits the screen in two, but on one side is like Scots and in the other side is English. In the Scots, you are a person with a job that you don't like, basically having an anxiety attack day. Like you're really struggling to get out of bed. You're really struggling to sort of even get out the door. If you do get to work, you basically have a panic attack. And then in the English text, which changes at the same pace, like as you make a choice on one side, a choice is made on the other. You are an adventurer in a sort of slightly cheesy kind of cave Dungeons and Dragons style kind of situation. And on the one screen, when you're having a panic attack, on the other, you're in a maze that you can't escape. And it's just, it's a really simple device, but just really sort of speaks really interestingly to the experience of anxiety. I did remember the name of the indie horror game maker. Kitty Horror Show is the practitioner, and Kitty Horror Show's itch page, kittyhorrorshow.itch.io, is very full of lots of super cool experiments. And that is the hot indie person that I'm always hearing about. But again, because I am not a horror person personally. I've not tried many kitty horror show games, I have to say.
Yeah, Kitty Horror Show's work is just exceptional. It is such a shining example of what can be done so interestingly and so cleverly in both genres, right? With both games and horror. I would definitely recommend playing Kitty Horror Show's games if you are interested. To anybody, not just to you. I think and to answer the second part of your question about like my favorite indie horror game, I think it might be Knock Knock by Ice Pick Lodge. So Knock Knock is, you play the experience. It's 2D side scroller of just like a cutaway of your house. And so you play as the lodger, and you're basically just trying to get through a night. But I believe that the game is trying to kind of represent like what happens when you have like a schizophrenic episode, or you are otherwise contending with a mental illness in a way of like time doesn't feel correct, and also you're battling against things that feel real and are real to you, and like how are you kind of navigating that. And so the game is really quite simple. You're just kind of walking around your house trying to turn on lights and trying to avoid the bad things, and you're just trying to make it through the night. And you can go and you can collect clocks to give yourself more time or to speed up time. And enemies will set you back time. So the longer that so if you do fall into more enemies, then the longer the night goes for you. And it's this really effective way of just kind of demonstrating the actual experience of having some sort of like mental episode or disorder, or even just insomnia. And just like, it really highlights the really real way that mental illness affects people. And it's not just an illusion. It's not just a hallucination. It is a real thing. And it does screw with your perception of time. It alters how you move around. Like, it makes you feel like you don't understand and you can't trust your reality. And so I think Knock Knock is really quite effective at that.
I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to offer the listeners, like one final thought or lesson just for their own practices.
Yeah, I think the critical thing too is like constraint-based media, be it epistolary novels, be it video games, be it found footage, whatever it is. I think we often sometimes will see constraint-based media and be like, oh, that's so easy, I could do that. But there's so much, and that's true, you can do that. I'm not saying that, but I am saying there's a lot of skill that goes into it as well. And like, I think there's a lot of interesting technique and specific kind of ideas and cleverness that comes out of constraint-based media that is harder to do than it looks. And I think that's really interesting to me. And I think there's a lot of fun in kind of understanding how you can use a constraint to be super creative, and what that means for things like games and found footage. I just think is really interesting and really inspiring.
And constraints can be formal in terms of the shape of the thing that you're making. They can be genre-based, and you know, one of the wonderful things about genre is so much work is already done in the heads of the audience that you can lean into, or you can sort of, you know, create some friction with their expectations in interesting ways. I think it's a wonderful thing to take away. Thank you. We are now into our things to promote section, and I know for certain that you have at least one thing to promote, but I wondered if you want to tell us a little bit more about your book to start with, and then let us know if there's anything else we should be paying attention to.
Yeah, so my book has released. It is available for purchase out there in the wild. So it is called Collaborative Worldbuilding for Video Games. It's published by CRC Press. And it's doing a few things. It is a book that is specifically about the interdisciplinary nature of world building for video games. It looks at how audio contributes, how programming contributes, how design and art and narrative and all that work together to create world building, both conceptually, but as well as practically. And so a big thing my book argues about is world building doesn't just happen in concept. It doesn't just happen in a world Bible. It happens as you're making the video game. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say practical world building, and that like, as you're making it, you are contributing to world building and you're making world building decisions. So the book is supposed to be a tool for games writers and narrative designers to kind of understand all the tools you have at your disposal on how to collaborate interdisciplinarily to get kind of the most coherent and aligned and resonant world building that you can. And then I also sneak in a little idea there that like world building is great as a story engine in that it can contribute ideas for characters and side quests and stories and all this stuff, but it's also good for a game engine. It can inform game modes and like verbs that you use and encounters that you use, and that so world building is also a great game design engine as well. So that is my book. I hope you pick it up and enjoy it.
Yeah, awesome. I'm certain that many folks will. And like you said, great for people coming from writing and storytelling sort of backgrounds, interested in the sort of affordances of the process of making games, right? But also, I imagine super good for students of games who just don't get a deep dive on anything because games courses have to cover so much. And also for established game designers who don't have any training or professional experience in story, can like to help them think about how decisions they're making or briefs they're setting are constraining their story professionals, collaborators, well or maybe unhelpfully, right?
Yeah, definitely. In the process of interviewing people and researching for this book, it totally rewrote how I understand audio and audio design as a part of the game making process and how critical audio is. And so even I learned a ton as I was interviewing folks for this book and doing my research. So
awesome. And also with a background as a professional editor, I bet yours had far fewer spelling mistakes sneak through compared to my book.
I do not think that's correct.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of One Cool Thing from Die Gute Fabrik. As usual, leave that rating or review where you can. If this time was of value to you, then that's a really good way to say thank you. I'll be back soon with a new episode speaking with another cool thinker and maker in the field of video games. And in the meantime, check out Die Gute Fabrik on Instagram, Twitter and YouTube at Gute Fabrik. That's GUTEFABRIK. This podcast was produced, edited and sound designed by Tom Wally. Additional production and research by Unaming Kavanagh. Our theme music is by Nick Ellis, whose music you can find under the name Tenby on Bandcamp. That's TENBY. Stay thoughtful, friends. Take care. Goodbye.